Eu vou lançar a pergunta ao Salil em inglês, portanto, se tiverem auriculares e quiserem usá-los, este é o momento. Salil, first of all, thank you very much for being here. It's the first time in a long time that a Secretary General of Amnesty International has been to Portugal on a high-level mission. This is as you well know, particularly difficult moment for Portugal, but also for Europe, it seems, from everything we have heard this morning. What is your take on how much in danger human rights are at this moment in Europe currently? And what can a country like Portugal do or say to influence Europe?
Thank you, Joanna. Unfortunately, I cannot speak Portuguese, so you have to suffer my Indian English today. I will try and speak slowly. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to be here in Lisbon. It's certainly one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, if not the world. And I'm particularly grateful and honored to be on this panel of very distinguished speakers. Some of you I've known before, some for the first time. I'm very privileged to be speaking alongside Mario Soares, who's a former Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. This word prisoner of conscience is quite amazing. Recently I was in Burma or Myanmar, and the word prisoner of conscience was coined by Amnesty International to talk about those who have been locked up in prison for no reason other than their political or religious beliefs, despite having only peacefully protested. Now the Burmese government now has made this an official term of the Burma. So they were telling me, Mr. Secretary General, we're very happy to tell you we have no prisoners of conscience. So I said, okay, now this has become an official term in the government of Myanmar. I think much has been said about the historical inspiration for Amnesty International's creation to Portugal. In fact, we always joke in Amnesty that if not for Salazar, we would not have had Amnesty International. So we're very grateful to the human rights violations of this country. But the timing of my visit is very crucial. You have just celebrated the 40th anniversary of your revolution. We have the European elections coming up very soon. Portugal's Universal Periodic Review has just been completed. Portugal is a candidate for the Human Rights Council 2015 to 2017. And we believe that the austerity impacts are really beginning to hurt. So it's a combination of all of these factors which has brought me to Portugal right now. I'm talking today much more about Europe, but I do want to say a few things about the human rights situation in Portugal before I go to the question of Europe and the role of Portugal in Europe. I think Katrina has been very eloquent in her, and I think Mario Soares has also mentioned about the austerity and the human rights impact of austerity measures. Much has been said about this. I think there are two very concrete things which we are going to be calling on the Prime Minister just after this meeting today. Number one is that we feel that there needs to be a human rights monitoring mechanism in place. Because it looks like the government has been taking steps on spending cuts without understanding or assessing the full human rights impact of these changes. So we believe that the government is celebrating a clean exit from the bailout loan. The fact is it's a very painful exit for a lot of people in this country, and we need a monitoring mechanism in place now to track what the real impacts of all of these policies are. And number two is that it's very clear whether you look at the UN Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights or you look at the Council of Europe Human Rights Commissioner reports, that these mechanisms which have been put in place, they cannot be permanent mechanisms. They have to be temporary mechanisms, time-bound mechanisms, and we need a clear commitment from the government that these mechanisms will be removed as soon as possible. Of course, we understand that the country is coming out of a deep economic crisis, and we understand that they have to balance the public expenditure with the revenues that we have. but that cannot be at the cost of human rights. The other key point I want to make on Portugal, which we are going to raise with the Prime Minister also, is that Portugal is a small country, but it has an important voice both in Lusophone countries across the world and inside Europe. Unfortunately, we are finding that when it comes to the human rights violations in key countries in Africa like Equatorial Guinea and Angola, Portugal is now preferring to maintain sort of diplomatic silence because of the economic factors becoming more important than human rights concerns. So this is something which we want to raise both with the Prime Minister and the media today. And secondly, in Europe itself, on the issue of migration, and that's my main subject of what I'm going to talk about, we think that Portugal has a key role to push for human rights in Europe on the refugee question, because on that issue, Portugal is more a transit country, so it doesn't have any major issues. There are challenges, but not major issues, so it's well placed to talk about this. Now, the theme before me today, which I've been asked to speak about, is on the future of human rights in Europe, the challenges and opportunities. I will read from a prepared text, mostly because of the translation, but also because I want to be on record on what I say today here. So we hear plenty of uplifting human rights language from European leaders. Too often, however, more and more, those fine words are not matched by actions. Europe today, from Amnesty International's perspective, is less confident, more insular than it seemed a few years ago. It seems to have abandoned its bigger commitment to ideals and values. The consequence is that we see social tensions across the continent, which are aggravated, of course, by the economic crisis. There is a widespread disenchantment with the establishment. Xenophobia is on the rise. Establishment parties, political parties, are afraid of their authority being eroded, and therefore they pander to the xenophobes. What we are seeing, meanwhile, is the construction of what we call Fortress Europe, and the complete abandonment of the solidarity, which Mario Soares just mentioned, that can and should be a human duty. We see a closing of the borders against those arriving in Europe from some of the most dangerous and difficult places in the world, from Syria, from Eritrea, from Afghanistan. I believe we need to give a voice to the many migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who cannot understand why they or their friends and relatives are being left to drown at sea, why they are being beaten for simply wanting to give themselves and their loved ones a better life, or why they are being detained in conditions that so many of us wouldn't think is possible in Europe. And in this context, I should mention the new refugee law which Portugal has come up with has a worrying element in relation to detention. We are worried that the scope of the law has been defined in such a broad way. As far as we are concerned, detention has to be the absolute last resort. But this new law opens up the possibility of using detention more widely. But let me tell you the story of a Syrian woman in her 30s with 6 children, who I will call Samia. Samia's husband has already fled to Switzerland, and Samia, is now desperately trying to join him with her children. No regular route is open to her, so she takes the difficult decision to make the dangerous journey to Europe so her children can be safe. Samia reached a small boat in Turkey, which she and her children boarded with 30 others. By the way, this is a true story which we have documented as Amnesty International. I've just changed the name of the individual for her own security. Now, during the journey, Greek coast guards rammed their boat near Agostonici Island in an attempt to scare them to turn back to Turkey. As Samia herself said, and I quote, "They took us to Agostonici Island, where we were detained for 7 days. We were incredibly dirty and wet, but there was no shower, and they did not give us dry clothes. They only gave us water, not even food. I had 100 euros with me. I spent it all to buy food in detention. A week later, they transferred us to Samos Island. I had no money left, so I couldn't even buy food. And it's not just by sea that Europeans are eager to turn back those who seek safety nets on European shores. Last week, Amnesty International published a report which details the deplorable treatment of refugees and migrants at Greece's land borders. Too often, instead of finding sanctuary, they are met with violence and intimidation. There are cases where they have been stripped naked, had their possessions stolen, and even held at gunpoint before being pushed back across the border to Turkey. The people carrying out these pushbacks are state agents. As such, the Greek authorities bear full responsibility for their actions. And Amnesty International believes that the authorities must openly acknowledge and ensure an end to the illegal and often dangerous practice of pushbacks. Pushbacks, as you know, are explicitly prohibited under Greek law, under European law, and international law. Now, the nature of geography is that fewer asylum seekers arrive on Portugal's shores as their first destination. But the question is not just a matter of what Greece or Italy or Portugal or any individual country is doing. This is a pan-European issue, and all Europeans with any humanity in them should care. Again and again, we receive the same feeble excuses from European leaders in Brussels and across the continent. First, we often hear that it is all about, and I quote, illegal migrants arriving at our shores. Now, this implies that the majority of those fleeing conflict or poverty are somehow just not willing to stay in their own country and that they're all criminals. Second, EU leaders argue that enhanced search and rescue will only feed the activity of smugglers and traffickers and fill their pockets. And finally, the shameful clinching argument. We hear that the EU is facing its own crisis and the boat is already full. But from our perspective, migration is not a crime, and no human being is illegal. In too much of Europe, migrant, asylum seeker, and refugee have become dirty words. Much of the debate on asylum and migration is fueled by implicit xenophobia, racism, or some mix of the two. We need a different debate based on fact, not fantasy, and one guided by human solidarity. The smugglers who make money by putting others on unsafe boats are not the cause of the problem of people dying at sea. At the moment, the EU's restrictive migration policies increasingly push people into the hands of smugglers and traffickers. If there were more legal channels, the space for smugglers would shrink and disappear. It is simply untrue that the EU is confronted with massive migration flows. In reality, the EU is anything but full. In fact, 2/3 of the world's refugees are hosted by the poorest countries of the world. The United States takes 50 to 60,000 refugees a year. The European Union, a meager 4,500. Given the EU's land size and population size, not to mention its wealth, these numbers are shamefully low. The way that European states are ready to trample the rules when it comes to pushback is, I believe, beyond shameful. And there's no comeback, even when behavior is clearly both inhuman and against the international rules. In short, double standards are rife. We have plenty of European rules, say, about the illegal dumping of fish in the sea. And when we see cases where such infringements are prosecuted as well. Human beings, though, seem to be in a different category, a lesser category. Throwing human beings in the sea seems to be fine. Fish is not fine. Now, I want to move to the second issue I want to touch on, which is discrimination. If Europe is often cruel against those who seek to enter this privileged continent, discrimination within Europe's borders is also far too widespread, as the Roma in Europe know all too well. There's plenty of talk in the European discourse of the equality of all citizens, but to quote George Orwell, some are clearly more equal than others. For the Roma communities of Europe, the daily reality is appalling discrimination, a living nightmare. Many live under the constant threat of violence and pogrom-like attacks. Thus, in the Czech Republic, angry mobs have increasingly attacked their homes and harassed Roma communities across the country. In the town of České Budějovice, they shouted, "Black swine," and let's get them while throwing stun grenades and glass bottles at their homes. This is again documented in Amnesty's reports. Hardly surprising perhaps to hear Michelle, a 27-year Romani, tell Amnesty International, and I quote, "I thought maybe this is what it was like during Hitler's era." Now, whether or not you accept comparisons with the 1930s, the fact is that European states are failing to curb and in some cases even fueling discrimination, intimidation and violence. The fact that racist attitudes remain entrenched in many police forces is often denied rather than addressed. Discrimination, forced evictions, segregation and substandard education are too often the norm. In France too, many of the 20,000 Roma in the country live in informal settlements where they rarely have access to basic services such as water and sanitation. They are often forcibly evicted from their shelters, harassed by the police or other citizens, and sometimes attacked. A Roma social worker who used to live in an informal settlement told Amnesty International, "Roma people are really scared of the police. I usually take kids to the hospital for medical treatments, and they're afraid whenever they see the police on our way." So the situation even in Portugal is far from rosy for Roma people. And all of this is part of the much bigger European context. For these are not just national failures, they're European failures. We need European leadership in order to confront the abuses that we see across the continent. This conference asks us to think about the opportunities as well as challenges. In this month of European elections, I believe the opportunities are very significant, as are the very real and substantial challenges. EU countries have so far failed to investigate crimes perpetrated against Romani communities or individuals, and have failed to seek to address the potential hate motives associated with these crimes. The Commission has failed to take clear and decisive action to address discrimination and violence against Roma in member states. And you mentioned, sir, about my visit to Brussels. I met with President Barroso, with Rompuy, with all of the key leaders in Brussels, and also Maria Soares referred to Angela Merkel, and I met Angela Merkel as well a month and a half ago, precisely to raise these very issues. But it's very clear that there is a complete failure of leadership in Europe to address these issues. So, of course, the question is, how do we change this? And really, there's only one way of changing this. Whether we want effective implementation of the EU's anti-discrimination legislation, including the Race Equality Directive, or if you want to get a human rights compliant migration system, the only solution is for ordinary people like us to put pressure on the leaders. And that's essentially what Amnesty International focuses on directly and with our partner organizations, many of whom are hosting this event, and I thank you for hosting me here today. You may think that pressure from ordinary people can change nothing, and such skepticism would be nothing new. But back in 1961, when the two Portuguese students were arrested and Amnesty International was created, many people told Peter Benenson that Amnesty International was one of the larger lunacies of our time. In the meantime, of course, this lunacy has attracted more than 3 million members across the world, and Amnesty International is growing in many, many parts of the world, and many thousands of prisoners of conscience have been released thanks to this lunacy. Now, I can hear people telling us that the idea is very misguided, that we can successfully confront anti-Roma and anti-migrant prejudices and violence, but I've repeatedly seen how such pressure from ordinary people can change the reality. And we know from conversations with officials in Brussels and in other capitals that campaigning from the grassroots makes a real difference. And this pressure is not easy. You will see many defeats, but at the end, you will see success. So I want to thank all the members and activists of Amnesty International in Portugal, across Europe, and across the world. Those of you who are not Amnesty members, it's a very good time for you to become one. Amnesty's colleagues and staff are here. you should take it as a responsibility. You will join many people across the world. And I want to just end by, by saying that when I first came to Lisbon, I had a very interesting experience because my village in India is from the southwestern coast, and it's a point where Vasco da Gama first landed in India in 1498. And I've many times gone to that site to see where he landed, and it brings back some nice memories and some not so nice memories. But I came here and I found the place where Vasco da Gama had left Portugal. So it was very nice to see the two sides of it. And I thank the Portuguese people for fighting a good fight despite all the challenges you're facing. Thank you very much.